from the Atlantic Council. I am marveled at the amount of people here with us in the morning. Transformations, Argentina's transformations open to the world. It is to me a true pleasure to have all these ministers, ambassadors, and other distinguished guests. Personally, it is always a pleasure to come back to my dear Argentina. I lived in the province of Córdoba more than 20 years ago, and I always feel at home back into Argentina. And at home in Washington, D.C., of course, we always drink Malbec from Argentina. First of all, let me warmly welcome Madeleine Albright, who has come to Buenos Aires to be here with us. It is a special moment when Secretary Madeleine Albright, such an influencing figure in the world, can be here with us in Buenos Aires. Thank you so much, Secretary Albright. I also want to thank Minister Susana Malcori to accompany us today. We have several partners for this conference. I want to thank HSBC, our main ally for the event, which support is part of a wider commitment with the region and the Atlantic Council. I will also want to thank the media, Cronista, Apertura, and Infotechnology. Also Baker McKenzie for their support, and our other partners, the AmCham, the CARI, and CERA, Argentine Council for International Relationships. This is a public event which is being streamed live. There is English to Spanish, Spanish to English translation. You can use your cell phones to send a tweet if you want, hashtag AC Argentina. Today is a very special moment in time. That's why we're here together today. We are only a few days away from the second anniversary of the presidency of President Macri. Just a few days away for Argentina to host the Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization. I want to thank once again Minister Malcorra, chair of that conference, for being here with us today. It's been a week now of the start of the leadership of Argentina in the G20. It is clear that the year 2017 is very different with President Macri and his administration, what they have started 2 years ago. It is amazing to see the enthusiasm generated and the renewed interest towards Argentina. This event will look for highlight the transformations experienced in Argentina, growing salaries, increase of consumption, higher levels of investments and exports that are strengthened, a higher capacity of the country to strengthen its international relations. The international profile of Argentina is growing. Adherence to the international organizations, it's another example of this trend. It is truly Argentina's time. The U.S. and the international community in general are looking towards Argentina with great interest, encouraging its continuous success as a dynamic democracy, prosperous one. From the Atlantic Council, a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, we are also disseminating the message about Argentina's new path. We have an excellent agenda for today. We'll be starting with Secretary Madeleine Albright, which will speak about the changing role of the country in the international scene. Then, together with Minister Malcorra, we'll have a discussion which I will moderate about the role of Argentina in the changing world stage. Then we will hear Minister Francisco Cabrera about his perspective on transformations under President Macri, together with the Financial Times. Then Marcelo Scaglione will offer their perspective about the OECD access. This is a panel with business leaders. Finally, Jorge Fauri will have his remarks. We will have all these extraordinary speakers in only 3 hours. I am pleased now to give the floor to Antonio Nesrani, which will introduce Secretary Madeleine Albright. He is the Vice Chairman of Global Banking HSBC in Argentina since 2016. Before joining HSBC, he was CEO of AST Partners and Axial Analytics, 2 companies founded by him. He started his financial career in JP Morgan, where he spent 7 years in New York and Buenos Aires. He is very welcome. Antonio, please take the floor. Thank you so much, Jason, for your words. It is such an honor to be here today representing HSBC, to welcome you all. First of all, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for organizing this event and also our partners which support this event as well. HSBC has worked for many years with the Atlantic Council organizing events like this in 3 different continents, and in particular with the Adrian Arsht Latin American Center, always focusing in common points of interest for the 2 institutions. And that is how today we're here in this event on Argentina's transformation and its reopening to the world. President Macri's administration has had as a priority from day one to reinsert Argentina in the world stage. For this, and as we were discussing last night with a group of participants, it has been essential to rebuild trust, not only with other governments, but also with the private sector. And I say this because, as you know, Argentina has made an effort in not complying with its word through history, but this administration has had very important achievements in this regard. As Jason just mentioned, Argentina has become the hosting country for the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference to be inaugurated this week. President of the G20, which has already started, but also achievements that had to do with the financial aspects and real economy, the reopening of the exchange rate market, the reinsertion of Argentina in the debt and capital markets, which have allowed arrangements with and agreements with the holdouts and a bond for 100 years. I have worked in this for my whole life. If someone would have told me 2 years ago that Argentina would issue a bond for 100 years, I would have laughed at the thought. But now it is a reality. But also the actual economy, the huge success of bidding contests for energy projects, both renewable and non-renewables, which have allowed to lower the price of electricity more than 30%. And the huge infrastructure plan that is being launched internationally by the government and which is so successful. President Macri's government has multiple objectives. Promoting growth, decreasing inflation and deficit is important, but it is not the only thing. To eradicate poverty, to eradicate drug trafficking, fighting organized crime, and above all, promoting unity amongst Argentinians. This, of course, is always subject to criticism. Some say it's going too fast, some say it's going too slow, but it is moving. And in October, we had the elections results that we had, and us from HSBC, we see the enormous trust and confidence in investments, both in the financial sector as well as in the actual economy. This makes us so optimistic for the short, medium, and long term of Argentina. Let me now introduce Secretary Madeleine Albright, which had a distinguished career as public strategic democratic leader. Secretary Albright was 64th Secretary of State in the U.S., first woman to occupy that position, and the woman with the highest rank in the administration at the time. Between 93 and 97, Secretary Albright was ambassador before the United Nations, and she has received the Presidential Medal to Liberty, the highest honor in the United States. She is currently chair of Albright Capital Manager, an investment company working in emerging markets. Additionally, she is a professor of international relations in Georgetown University and author to numerous books. Let me give you our distinguished guest.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for your kind introduction, and I apologize to speak in English. I am very pleased to be here, and I want to thank the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsh Center and HSBC for organizing this terrific conference. This is truly an impressive forum with a great list of speakers, and I'm delighted to participate alongside my very good friend, Susana Malcorra. It's an honor to be with you again. I'm also delighted to return to Argentina. Now, some of you have been and are ministers, and you know that sometimes you are asked to do things and you can't figure out why. And what happened was when I first became Secretary of State, I was told that I had to go to a conference in Kuala Lumpur in order to be a part of the ASEAN Regional Forum. And that, in fact, the custom there is that the last night there are always skits, plays, presented by each delegation, and I was told the United States always does very badly. And all of a sudden, the State Department gave me lyrics to Mary Had a Little Lamb, and I said, I am not singing that. So on the way over to Malaysia, I decided that we would do something else, and that I would sing Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis. And so we made up lyrics. I got dressed up as Madonna, and I actually sang Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis. I had a lot of lipstick on and a flower in my hair. And the audience cheered, and I had a very good time. But I was promptly informed that it would be very risky for me to ever go back to Buenos Aires. So I apologize for hinting at any comparison between myself and Evita, and also between myself and Madonna. So thank you very much. And I was very, very pleased to have been greeted yesterday by President Macri. So I feel welcomed again. And I have had wonderful meetings with so many people, and I'm very glad to be back. I came to Argentina the first time as a professor in 1982, and then I came twice as Secretary of State including once in the company of President Clinton. And I had the privilege at that time of working very closely with Foreign Ministers Guido di Tella and Rodriguez Javarina, and very nice to be together, and also with my very good friend Emilio Cardenas, who was the Argentinian ambassador at the time that I was at the United Nations. So I'm very pleased that during the 1990s, our two countries were able to develop a very close and healthy working relationship. And there was respect on both sides. So this obviously was due in part to the personalities of those in power, but more important, in so many ways, there was a convergence of national interests. And that is what is happening today. I was very, very glad in my time here to really rediscover how much our countries had in common. Both Argentina and the United States are vigorous supporters of democracy. We have a strong trade relationship, which now exceeds $20 billion annually. We both oppose terrorism because we've been victimized by it, including the recent attack in New York, which claims the lives of 5 high school classmates from Rosario. And regrettably, that was not the only tragedy to have hit Argentina in recent weeks. And in my meeting with President Macri, I expressed my very deep sadness over the disappearance of the San Juan. This is a terrible loss for the families of the sailors and for the people of Argentina and for the world. But I'm proud of the response of the United States military, which immediately deployed search and rescue assets to help along with Argentinian efforts. The speed and scale of the American response, I think, testifies to the importance that we all place on our relationship. And while there is an awful lot of disagreement in Washington about the Trump administration's foreign policy, I came here in part to tell you that there is strong bipartisan consensus around the idea of strengthening U.S.-Argentinian relations. And I was very pleased that President Macri was welcomed to the Oval Office by President Trump early in his term, roughly a year after President Obama's successful trip to Buenos Aires. And I was also glad that Vice President Pence came here to give a major speech during his inaugural trip to Latin America. In addition to these deepening political relationships, I can attest that President Macri's economic reforms are attracting the interest of U.S. companies who are very, very eager to build stronger business relationships and invest in this economy for the long term. The results of the October midterm elections have only heightened the sense of optimism about Argentina's trajectory. And while there is an awful lot of work ahead, what the U.S. business community and political leaders recognize is that your success is very much in the interests of the United States, but mostly how much it is in the interests of the people of Argentina. As this audience is fully aware, this month represents a major milestone in Argentina's progress. Last week marked the beginning of your year-long presidency of the G20, and next week you will host the World Trade Organization Ministerial with Minister Malcorra. And I have to say, in many of my meetings here, I have been so impressed by the very diligent and effective work that those who are preparing those meetings are undertaking. It is a sign of, I found, anyway, my impression of pleasure at having so much hard work and to being truly recognized by the international community, because these are the clearest signs that Argentina is not only reopening to the world and taking a more proactive global role under the new president. And I think that it is very important, and to have met so many very, very effective members of the team has been a pleasure for me. And this is important because there's an urgent need for effective international leadership today. And to see that all you have to do is to scan the global horizon, beginning with Washington, where I am sorry to say partisan polarization and political dysfunction are harming the reputation and credibility of the United States. Across the Atlantic, the European Union has been preoccupied with its own institutional challenges, and its leaders have also been weakened by political upheaval and a surge in populism. In Asia, as well as in Latin America, the withdrawal of the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement has left a very big opening for China, which is skillfully extending its influence on both economic and security matters. Meanwhile, there are conflicting tendencies at work in this, our own hemisphere. For even as Argentina moves ahead on economic reform and poverty reduction under President Macri, and the continent's last remaining armed conflict comes to an end in Colombia, we have a government in Venezuela that is running its country into the ground and an intolerable level of violence in Central America's Northern Triangle. U.S.-led efforts to promote greater regional economic integration have also run into turbulence. When I was in office, we had very high hopes that a free trade area of the Americas might be negotiated. But such an agreement failed to move forward, and now we have a U.S. administration that is threatening to leave the NAFTA. As a U.S. citizen, I was disappointed that the Trump administration is missing an opportunity to play a more positive role on trade in this hemisphere. But as a proponent of deeper regional integration, I am so pleased to see Argentina stepping up your own efforts on a range of important issues. President Macri has been a leading voice for human rights and democracy in Venezuela and Argentina, and has helped mobilize the Americas to support a democratic transition there. He has also pledged to make Latin America a centerpiece of Argentina's G20 presidency, which will boost the region's international profile and open up new opportunities globally. Meanwhile, as a leader in Mercosur, Argentina is pushing ahead on trade negotiations with Canada and the European Union. And by also hosting next week's WTO Ministerial, Argentina is helping to breathe new life into that institution and to push back against a growing tide of protectionism. Argentina has also accepted increasing numbers of refugees from Syria, demonstrating that when it comes to global humanitarian crisis, it doesn't just talk, it acts. So I'm very encouraged by the leadership Argentina is demonstrating, but I should also say, frankly, that I'm not surprised, and that's because I've seen it before. About 30 years ago, I participated in a conference on democratic transitions in which Argentina played a featured role. The purpose of the conference was to enable civilian and military officials from your country to explain to foreign counterparts how to manage the transition from dictatorship to democracy. The Argentine representatives talked about the challenge of persuading the military to take orders from civilians and giving civilians the confidence they needed to give directions to the military. They emphasized the importance of finding the right role for the armed forces within a modern democratic society and of creating legislative committees that would know enough to be bold enough to hold the military accountable. The conference was a great success, and those who attended were impressed by Argentina's example to the world. Today, it is once again time to be impressed by Argentina's example for the world. The past 3 decades have seen periods of optimism and growth, as well as economic crisis and isolation. Both populism and protectionism took hold in Argentina. Through it all, Argentina has emerged with a democracy that is not simply intact, but stronger than ever. And this should remind us, and remind all of us, that history doesn't move in a straight line, and that democracy's great advantage is the ability to correct its own faults through the development of fresh ideas, the conception of innovative policies, and the periodic emergence of new and visionary leaders. While there are many reasons to hope for the success of President Macri's economic reform agenda, one of the most important is the message it would send to other countries that hard times provide no excuse for abandoning democratic institutions. On the contrary, democracy provides the best means for getting back to the right path. And this is also why it's important that Argentina is increasing its involvement in global institutions even as other democracies pull back. There's one especially that I'm concerned about. It sends a message that global problems require a global response. We will not get anywhere if we are unwilling to work together as a team. So as I look forward, I hope that the United States and Argentina will continue to work together as a team, and that we will do so based not only on shared interests, but also on shared values. When I was Secretary of State, I had the privilege of meeting on several occasions with the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. I strongly supported the release of documents that were in the possession of the United States and that contained information related to human rights violations that occurred here in the 1970s. It is not for me to say how that period in time should be dealt with by your government and courts, but I believed it only right that the United States should make available any information that we had. I also believe it is essential for both the United States and Argentina to adhere to the highest standards with respect to our own policies and actions in the years ahead. With all that is going on in the world, I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I am an optimist who worries a lot. Without underestimating the challenges, I believe firmly in the ability of humans to learn from history, to establish and live by the rule of law, and create economic and political arrangements that work to the advantage of all countries. But to make progress, we have to do the best possible job, not simply of expressing what we think, but also of understanding how and why others act as they do. We cannot assume that all governments will make the right choices, nor can we assume that the forces of enlightenment and freedom will always prevail. Good intentions can lead to unintended consequences. Those who feel threatened by globalization can be counted on to make their fears known through nationalism, protectionism, and political protests. Risk is a permanent factor in world affairs. Danger will always be with us. To succeed, and indeed to survive, we must act responsibly as nations, business people, and citizens. We should not hesitate to voice our support for the principles of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and a commitment to intercultural understanding and peace. We must reinvigorate our friendships, build a world economy that is more inclusive, and generate ideas for bringing people together instead of driving them apart. Now, that's a tall order and not a job for those who are only focused on the short term, but that has never been the Argentine way. Your great hero, General San Martin, once famously said, and I quote, "All progress is the child of time," unquote. More than 20 years ago, I accompanied President Clinton to a wreath-laying ceremony at the tomb of the general. And I would like to end my remarks by invoking President Clinton's own call to action from that day. He said, "With high hopes, strong resolve, and generous spirits, let us take our chance and do our duty together to make progress the child of this time." So my thanks once again to the Atlantic Council, HSBC, and all of our sponsors and participants for recognizing the importance of this moment in time and for helping us come together and renew our commitment to a better future for Argentina and the world. Thank you very much, and I very much look forward to our discussion.
Secretary Albright, thank you for those incredibly compelling remarks, and especially your important message. We're going to be taking questions via note cards toward the end of our conversation, so I wouldn't be surprised if we do get a request for your rendition of Don't Cry For Me, Asianis. Maybe I won't choose that one, but we might get that. To all those in the audience, please note that this panel will be in English. And first, let me say that it's a great privilege to be moderating this discussion on Argentina's leadership on the global stage and sharing the stage with Secretary Albright and with you, Minister Malcorda. At this moment, especially where as chair of the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference, you're in the midst of final preparations for the meetings that are set to begin. And I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to join us, Minister, at such a busy time. Minister Malcorda is well known to this audience. She served under President Macri as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Warship from 2015 until May of this year. And beforehand, she served for a number of years at the United Nations, ending up as Chief of Staff to the Secretary General. Prior to entering her career in the public service, the minister had a very robust career in the private sector, including serving as CEO of Telecom Argentina. So, Minister Malcorda, welcome very much. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks to the Atlantic Council, HSBC, and all the sponsors for giving us the opportunity to gather here. And thanks, Madeline. It's always good to hear you. You are an inspiration, and you know that. It is good to take stock. We are always so busy, moving so fast, that often don't give ourselves the opportunity to take stock. And I think this 2-year mark that comes to us on Sunday is the moment, and Atlantic Council got that, to take stock of what is it that we have done against what is it that we have promised to do, but also how to adjust course as democracies should do in order to go even farther or to correct what needs correction. When President Macri called me to propose that I become the foreign minister, we talked a lot about what is it that I could bring to the job, and he persuaded me that I could do it. And our conversation was based on the notion that we needed to reinsert Argentina in the world, but that we needed to do it in an intelligent manner. And I always go back to this added intelligence to the reinsertion in the world. And that means that we always thought that keeping Argentina close, keeping Argentina looking inwards, keeping Argentina only talking to a very few people in the world did not get us to the right place. On the contrary, it got us to a point where we saw a stagnant Argentina, not only internally, but also externally. But going back to the world needed a view that was a very special one. It needed a view where we needed to build on those things where we are strong, we are good, but we needed to recognize those areas where we had weaknesses, where we need room for improvement. And going out, we had to really make our case on our strength, but more importantly, or as importantly, we needed to look into the opportunities to buy the time, give the horizon, give the certainty for those sectors, those areas that needed improvement. And that has been at the center of what we have been doing. That's why we decided to work so hard on the Mercosur, which is our base, because that will be the first step to be stronger, not only as Argentina, but also as the market, the Mercosur. Then we decided that as Mercosur, we had to really move faster on some of the long-term pending issues, and we started to work with the European Union on something that might materialize as an agreement in the coming weeks, maybe days. And here I want to stop for a minute because it is always felt like a threat when we try to move forward on these agreements. These agreements give exactly that, give certainty, give a framework, give time to adjust and adapt to those things that require adjustment, and give the predictability that allows for investments to take place so that we really make the changes that are required in the sectors that are required. We also got very close to Canada, and we are working with Canada, Korea, Japan, and many other countries that are keen to closing an agreement with Mercosur. But we also decided to stop and end that divide that we had between Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance, and we built strong and robust ties with the Pacific Alliance, recognizing that there are very two different creators, but they should be working together to close their gaps. As our sort of crown decisions, we went for the presidency of the G20 and to request to host the ministerial meeting of WTO, full sure that maybe we will get one of them. Guess what? We got both, and we are now overwhelmed by so much recognition by our friends in the world. And here again, we are doing it with a view to not to show an Argentina that teaches the world what to do. We are not in that position. We want to show an Argentina that is trustworthy, an Argentina that is a good partner, that listens, that brings a view from the South that is constructive. But most importantly, at the center, an Argentina that is ready to build bridges. In a world, as Madeleine very well described, where the gaps start to enlarge, where divisions seem to become bigger, where the traditional supporters of a world that comes together are now closing themselves. Our opportunity is to first explain what happens when you close down and what are the results, not in a theoretical manner, in a very practical one, but also to put on the table, out of that experience, what is that we all collectively can do to reinforce the systems that connect us and bring us together. That's what we are trying to do in the WTO conference. Very challenging conference in a very challenging time, where some argue there could be an implosion of the system. I don't believe so. I share with Madeleine's optimism, otherwise you cannot do this job. But I believe deeply that what we need is a rules-based system that allows all of us to work together, committing to those rules, abiding by those rules, but also ready to improve that system, to change what is needed, to work on what has to be corrected. I hope that this conference will yield that recommitment to the system, but it will also yield some concrete deliverables, some concrete results that will allow for our agenda, our shared agenda, to move forward. So we have a lot on our shoulders. The G20 process, and I always emphasize this, the G20 is not an event, it's a process. The 50 meetings that will take place in Argentina will put our country and its beauty at the center, not only talking substance, but also showing what we are and how we are. And we'll end a year from now with the leaders of the world being in Buenos Aires. Let's use that also as the excuse to work internally on those things that we need to improve. It's not just losing time. It's not to show off what we are to the external world, is a circular exercise where we project from where we are, our experience, our southern view, but we also, from that exercise, strengthen ourselves and come out of the exercise better, with a better understanding of the others, as Madeleine said, and with more empathy, mutual empathy, that will allow us to get what in the end is absolutely required, those investments that bring the so desired economic activity that in the end will take us out of the 30% level of poverty that we have inherited. That is the only objective, and that's what we are trying to do. It's not inserting ourselves just for the sake of doing it, is to transform the lives of our people.
Thank you, Minister, and I want to get back to the I think your explanation of the goals couldn't be more eloquent and more convincing to this audience. We're going to have people come around in a few minutes and collect note cards. So if you have questions, there'll be people circulating. Feel free to hand your questions. What we're going to do now is we're going to touch on a few different themes. One is the changing nature of Argentina's foreign policy, democracies, their role in today's world, looking specifically at the upcoming WTO Ministerial and globalization issues. Turning back to you, Secretary Albright, and then Mr. Malcor, I want to drill down a little bit more on the results of Argentina's position. But Secretary, you mentioned in one of the themes in your opening speech was about the great state of transformation that we're seeing in the world today, and Argentina's role, Argentina's positive role in that regard. But what we're also seeing is that countries around the world, that the traditional way of doing business is being upended in country after country around the world. And as we see a number of countries becoming more inward-looking, Argentina is doing exactly the opposite, as Minister Malcor just explained. From your perspective, what are some of the lessons for how a country like Argentina can best maximize a new outward-facing position, especially at a time when there are so many forces globally that are pushing for more of an inward-focused approach?
Well, I do think that it is, as I mentioned in my remarks, so timely that a country such as Argentina all of a sudden is re-entering the world with good values, democracy, and talking. I listened with great pleasure to the minister's comments because she hit all the right points in terms of trust, understanding that whatever any country does, it's the responsibility of the president of a country to protect her people, territory, and way of life. That's what it's about. But in doing that, I think those countries that understand that that can only be done by being part of a global system with rules, and I think that's a very important point. It can't kind of just be touchy-feely. There has to be a set of rules that it gains for the country's people and also internationally. And so what I have been troubled by is that we are going through an era where there is not enough faith in any institution, but much less international institutions. And if Argentina, that has come through a difficult period, is a country which is of the right size in many ways, not one of the biggest countries, not a teeny country, and in a very important location, can kind of say, we have just reemerged into a responsible position, it can be a very big leader. And I have been saying, I do agree with you that there's a lot of work, and I clearly have witnessed that, but the enthusiasm and optimism of bringing Argentina back into a very responsible international position, saying exactly the kinds of things the minister said in terms of rules, trust, a desire to be a part of it, and not to close down the borders, because for me, the biggest mistake for any country is to decide that protecting itself behind its own border and building walls, that is the worst thing that can happen for a country.
Minister, you mentioned a number of the different activities that Argentina is undertaking in this very special moment, whether it's the G20, whether it's the 11th WTO Ministerial that you're co-chairing, the accession process to the OECD. How is Argentina more positioning itself to ensure that these different international activities are resulting in tangible benefits longer term for the country?
Well, the two events that you referred to are very different. In the case of the WTO, the agenda is set by the 164 member states. Essentially, at the heart of the agenda is what was discussed in 2002 in Doha, the famous Doha round. And what we are trying to do as the chair is to make sure that we move that agenda forward, that we achieve a few results, but also trying to see whether we can add new subjects of discussion to the agenda, subjects of what we call the 21st century, like micro, small and medium enterprises, investment facilitation, e-commerce. So we are trying to see that as Argentina, we help introduce those subjects that are dear to us and make a difference in creating jobs, which is at the center again. In the case of the G20, I think there the president has announced the agenda last week, as was said earlier, and in that regard, we are able to shape at least part of the agenda. Part comes from prior meetings, and there we have focused again on a full alignment between what we have as our priorities and what we are putting on the table. And we are doing it in a manner that can, again, be a source of learning for us. Not only we put ideas on the table, but we learn from the discussion. I think also we must not underestimate how much we learn from the exercise of having these events in Buenos Aires. How much more professional, how much we have to deliver, how much we have to make things happen, trains run on time, even those details. When you do it at the level that needs to be done, with all the leaders coming here next year, that is an exercise that will leave a stronger Argentina behind. So I think we get a lot out of this, even though it may not be a tangible result today. It is an incredible exercise that many will like to go through and sort of envy I for having the opportunity to have both here.
And as you say as well, it's really it's an opportunity to really showcase to all the business leaders globally how great of a place Argentina is to do business.
Indeed. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this ministerial has a number of side events that is record in any other ministerial in the past. And we are having for the first time a business forum that it will be running in parallel to the ministerial. So what we are trying to do is translate some of that opaque discussion that goes behind closed doors that nobody understands, that uses a language that is absolutely unmanageable, into something that really relates to people. And we are having the parliamentarians coming here to endorse and support the WTO. We are having civil society, we are having business, we are having think tanks, we are having academia. We are having a lot, some to the tune of 15 side events, that this is becoming, for the ones who know, a little bit like the week of the General Assembly in the UN. But it's important because that creates a narrative that can be translated in language that people understand. And hopefully this will help minimize the distance between people and these institutions, which is part of the reason why people don't feel represented by these institutions.
Secretary Alvear, you've spoken about institutions and how institutions can remain effective moving forward. And I guess with the WTO Ministerial coming up this weekend, how do organizations like the WTO remain effective at a time of increasing challenges, especially challenges insofar as reaching consensus among members?
Well, I do think that there's a general question about how institutions function, whether international or national. And I have kind of talked about the fact that we are in a new era. After World War II is when most of the institutions were founded. I have said now a number of times, institutions like people at age 70 need to refurbish a little bit. Those institutions have to be looked at. Then the next era came with the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and a whole kind of readjustment because so many policies were done on the basis of fighting communism and the Cold War. Now in the 21st century, we are looking at technology, the effect of technology on institutions and jobs, and a real question as to how people trust their institution. I do teach. I tell my students that plagiarism is terrible. However, I am now plagiarizing this line because it is so good. I have stolen it from Silicon Valley. And that is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. And so there is no faith in institutions, and that's what we have to do, is to make them more resilient. The consensus part is difficult, I have to say, especially when there are 193 or even 24 or whatever. And so I think that developing that, but that is what comes from pre-meetings, I think, of trying to figure out where there are some common goals and trying to develop a language that actually responds to that.
And Mr. Macri, with the difficulty in reaching consensus among so many members, what do you see, if you could give a little preview to the audience of the upcoming ministerial, what do you see as some of the potential outcomes that we can expect to see?
Well, of course, I cannot prejudge, and I have to say this because otherwise I will be killed as a chair, so I cannot prejudge. I think the first outcome is the one that I referred to at the beginning, which is the reconfirmation of our commitment to the WTO and the rules-based system. That is, I will say, a prerequisite to any other thing that we might decide, and in this context, is highly valuable from a political level. I think that is the first element that we need to achieve. Then there are two sets of issues. One, the traditional ones around Doha. There, I think we might have a chance to have some good deliverables around fisheries. This is something that has been pending for a long time, hasn't moved. Now it looks like we might have a combination of some decision on specific issues and some process to finalize the negotiations by 2019, which will be a great achievement. Agriculture is tough. I'm not sure we will be able to have something so concrete on agriculture. The issues that are left in agriculture are issues that are very difficult to break. But we might be able to, again, put together something that puts in motion, within certain parameters, a more specific discussion on those pending issues. I hope we can launch discussions on some of the issues that I referred earlier, like e-commerce, which is in the agenda of WTO, but it's a very fragmented agenda. We have to bring it to the forefront in a different manner. On something that is very dear to us Argentinians, which is micro, small, and medium enterprises, and maybe something on investment facilitation related to trade. If a package like this, which is a combination of decisions and processes launch, is put in place under the chapeau of a commitment to the system, I think we will really achieve a lot. And let me say something to finish. I have coined a phrase in the last meeting of some ministers we had in Marrakesh, which says, there is life after Buenos Aires. This means that this is a milestone. We cannot expect to solve all the problems of the world, particularly in this context in Buenos Aires. But if we secure life, we are very successful.
Very excellent. The Secretary Albright, I wanted to just shift a little bit from the WTO Ministerial and first say, Mr. Macri, that I think it's going to be very successful, especially under your leadership. And I think the goals that you identified are really the right ones, and so very optimistic about it. Secretary Albright, you've spent a lot of your long, renowned career focusing on supporting democracies worldwide. I think more recently, a lot of focus and work on looking at authoritarianism and how authoritarianism rises in different countries. I'd like your impressions, your thoughts on this mix of what we're seeing globally, of this rise of authoritarianism in certain countries, and then looking in Argentina, looking at the ingredients that are critical for democracies to not only survive, but for democracies to thrive. I mean, we're at this point in Argentina with this new life on democracy that we've reached. And what are some of your thoughts on some of those critical ingredients for democracies to thrive? And before answering that, I'd like to welcome Minister Cabrera, who just entered the room.
Well, I do think I have spent a lot of time on this, and one of the issues that I found, I'm very tired always when people say X country is not ready for democracy, or X part of the world is not ready for democracy. I think we're all the same. People want to be able to make decisions about their own lives, and they begin by deciding where they want to live and what school they want to send their children to and what language. But ultimately, it's about making decisions about how they want to be ruled. And so the question is, what are the nuts and bolts of democracy and how they work, and what opportunities do countries have for it? I do think that we are going through a pretty tough time on democracy. And I have sometimes kind of talked about two mega trends and their downside. Big mega trend is obviously globalization. We all know the possibilities of that and how it has opened up life for so many different people, and most of us are beneficiaries of it. The problem is that it's faceless, and people need an identity. You're proud to be an Argentine, I'm proud to be an American, and we want to know what language we speak or what religion we are. But when my tribe doesn't like your tribe, terrible things happen. And I have been very troubled by what's been going on in Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, where they all, after the fall of communism, wanted to be part of the European Union. Now they're complaining about the faceless bureaucrat in Brussels, and they now want to have very strict protectionism and nationalism. Patriotism is one thing. Hyper-nationalism is very dangerous. The other trend is technology, which is incredible because, and I always like to talk about the woman farmer in Kenya who doesn't have to walk miles to pay her bills. She can do it with a mobile phone. But the downside of technology is it has separated people's voices and disaggregated, and so it is hard to create a system, especially if everybody has their own source of information. And so what happens is there are huge divisions now that are often in societies that are then captured by demagogues who inculcate fear in people, and all of a sudden you end up with an authoritarian government. And Argentina learned the lesson. And I think that that's what's so interesting in terms of the emergence or the reemergence of democracy in this country.
I'd like to just, we collected some note cards, and we had a number of questions. We can only get to two of those questions, but Minister Macri, one of the questions relates to this topic of globalization that the Secretary was just speaking about, and how globalization is fundamentally changing the way in which we interact with each other. And the question is, how is Argentina dealing with this new reality? How is Argentina best positioning itself, especially in light of all the upcoming events that it's hosting, to not only deal with the reality of globalization, but really to maximize the potential opportunities of globalization?
Well, when I was referring earlier to our decision to insert intelligently Argentina in the world, was precisely taking into account this question of globalization. You know, globalization is perceived both as an opportunity and as a threat, and that threat aspect is what could put things into critical path. I think what we have to do is create in ourselves the self-confidence that we can really perform well in a globalized world. Creating the self-confidence is not an act of God. It requires the investments in infrastructure, the investments in education, the transformation of our workforce into a workforce that is adaptable and adjustable. All these things are behind what is now being put forward as the reforms that the president wants to foster and are being worked through the Congress. So all of this that sometimes we discuss in very technical terms has a meaningful sense of how we prepare ourselves, particularly how we prepare our people to adapt and adjust to that globalization and to move from this notion of being threatened to a notion of this is an opportunity and we adjust ourselves. It takes time. It doesn't happen from one day to the next. You have to have a game plan there. But it's also true that unless we have this view, we will not adjust to what is it that is our target, and we need adjustment. So that is why we are so keen on setting plans that provide the base for the change that is required to be fit for globalization.
And with that, I'd like to turn to Secretary Albright with the last question, which comes from the audience as well, which is a question on U.S.-Argentina relations, well, specifically a question on how the U.S. and Argentina can best support each other in multilateral institutions. And I'll add on to that a question to you as well of what do you see as what's needed to really move the needle on the economic front to further strengthen U.S.-Argentina relations?
Well, I really do think, first of all, there is the bilateral relationship that has had some success in the past in terms of investments, trade, et cetera. But I also think, and again, in listening to my friend Susanna, I think it would be very good for U.S.-Argentine relations to support what the goals are of the WTO and the G20, which may be difficult for some of the people in our government who don't seem to believe in multilateral action. And so I do think that it's important to support a country that we care deeply about, Argentina, in the way that it sees its role internationally, because then it can, in fact, benefit everybody. And I do think, I hope, and I'm sure that there already is a lot of bilateral consultation in terms of doing both things, because it will benefit all. And I so believe in an open system where we are not looking for winners and losers in the international trading system, but a common goal of lifting up. And I think that by the U.S. supporting Argentina's goals in this is a good way to support Argentina and the system.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to end our panel because afterwards, Minister of Production Francisco Pereira will be in a discussion with Benedict Mander of the Financial Times. With that, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Secretary Albright and Minister Marcorda for an excellent conversation.
Buenos días. Soy Benedict Mander, corresponsal del
I'm Benedict Mander, correspondent of the Financial Times. It's an honor to introduce Minister of Production Francisco Cabrera. He was Minister of Economic Development between 2007 and 2015 for the city of Buenos Aires. He also worked in the private sector for HP and the HSBC group. And now, Minister, please, the floor is yours. Good morning to you all. Thank you for the invitation. The truth is that it is an honor to be here today, debating and talking, and above all, telling you about what we think the future of Argentina is and how Argentina is going to reinsert into the world and how it's going to open to get integrated to the world of today. We started off with our administration 2 years ago in a context of 15 years of Argentina being an isolated country. And the truth is that the situation we have today is very different to the one we had 2 years ago. This 2-year process, we like to call it the process of normalizing the Argentinian economy. So what we did in these 2 years was to have a more normal economy, understanding by this an economy that is similar to those economies of most of the countries in the world. And we think that we are finishing these last 2 years with the heading that says that Argentina has become a normal, a regular country, a country that can export and import, a country where you can invest, where we can pay for dividends, where we can make decisions of investment. And we still know there's a lot to take forward. And we know that the difference, it's a lot with what we had 2 years ago. And this is basically not because we decided as a government to change Argentina, but I think that those who decided to change Argentina is the Argentinian people. Argentinian people were convinced of the fact that Argentina had to enter the 21st century and had to stop looking towards the past. And these fed us and gave us political power in order to move forward with the reforms. Today, we are in a situation that is very important. It's very important to talk about the current situation because the country that we will have in February 2018 will be very different to the country that we had 30 days ago. It will be a country that would have moved forward in a lot of reforms and structural changes that we have believed for many years, and many Argentinians think that they're necessary to implement. But why are we in these situations? Because a while ago, there was an elections that we won, and these results of these elections shown that there was no way back. And therefore, the horizon for changes were longer, and that, in fact, all the political officials were discussing how to enter this Argentina of the future. I think that this is highly relevant because in 2016 we organized an investment forum that was very important in Argentina. There was a relevant summoning because there was also an important curiosity for this new Argentina that seemed to be willing to integrate to the world. We had over 1,000 international companies attending that came to Buenos Aires, and our Argentine investment agenda structured the interviews so as to try to understand what were the concerns of the company that came to Argentina, to try to understand whether they could invest, and if that was the case, in what areas. And the common denominator of 400 structured interviews was one: to what extent these changes are sustainable and to what extent they will be stable in time. So the concern had to do with politics. So this doubt was cleared last October. And we want all the political officials looking forwards. And obviously there are some subtle differences, one more to one side, one more to the other side, but everyone wants to have an Argentina of the 21st century. So the country we will have in March will be different because right now we are discussing a tax reform, a fiscal agreement that puts a limit to the growth of public spending in Argentina. We are discussing a labor law as well, law that defends competition. We are also debating a law of the capital market, and we're also discussing a free trade agreement with the European Union that is outside Congress. So if all these things happen, Argentina will clearly be a very different country to the ones we had a previous months ago. So why are we discussing all these topics? Well, we had a plan in which we understood that Argentina was a country with a low economic productivity. So we decided to have a plan that improves Argentina's productivity, and we called it National Productivity Plan, and we identified 8 pillars around which we had to work. And these were the duties of the government itself that make us be very active in order to improve the productivity of the economy. And this was access to funding and the cost of capital. That is also important. This is why it's important to have this new law of capital market. Another issue was the productivity of the companies and the lack of predictability of labor costs, and they are very high, and a small company is very much afraid of hiring a new employee because they don't know how much it will cost if they have to dismiss him. So they need to have this predictability. We are having very important reform. Argentina has still 5 million employees that are in informal sector, and we said we had to have access to technology to improve productivity. The tariffs of computers were reduced to 0. We opened this market, and we understood that it was necessary for companies to have access to the education and to technology. So technology had to be the cheapest as possible. We decided to do bureaucratic simplification, and we're working on this. We are having a series of executive orders that address the heart of simplifying the red tape or bureaucracy in Argentina. We have set a target of reducing 1 point of GDP in 2 years' time. That is the transfer of resources from the productive sector to the bureaucracy, where this gets diluted in all these errands and authorizations and paperwork and records and delays and rates. So all this will be removed, and the impact would be of 1 point of the GDP. We also said that we had to have a tax reform so as not to have distortive taxes. We're working strongly on this. And I would also like to talk about the law that defends competition. That is, any investor that wants to come in Argentina, they want to understand how the Argentinian government and the state deals with abusive or domineering positions in the market. That is, what is the institutional structure to deal with these topics? So we're also fostering this act that defends competition, and we believe in this. And also another topic that has to do with this forum, and it's one of the pillars, and it's the intelligent integration to the world. How do we make Argentina to integrate successfully to the world and to stop being isolated? We say that Argentina is an isolated country because when you look at Argentina based on its export capacity in terms of the GDP, it's the third closest country internally after Sudan and Algeria. We have free trade agreements with less than 9% of the GDP of the world. If we end up closing this agreement with the European Union, we will have free trade area agreements with 30% of the GDP of the world. So this is a qualitative leap that is very important, with a high impact on institutional topics, on productive strategy, investments, and of course commerce. So we have high expectations, and we're really optimistic about this. So I wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to describe where we are today and how we are envisioning Argentina. Of course, we still have a series of tasks that we need to endure in an administration. We work as a team, and Mauricio, our president, has a clear objective of a competitive Argentina that's integrated to the world, and modern Argentina that no longer looks towards the past, but it looks towards the future, where we know what Argentinian people want. They want to live in peace. They want to live in a country that grows. They want to be employed and to be able to come and leave the country freely and to have education for all our children. So I just wanted to do this brief introduction, and I would like to thank you for receiving me here at this forum. Thank you. Well, I said everything that needed to be said. Thank you for your comments, Minister. Undoubtedly, Argentina is going through very important times since you're fostering a series of reforms that could have a very deep impact on the economy. So I just wanted to talk a bit more about the reforms, the ones that have been implemented and the coming ones. First, the key issue is investment. It's clear that we have received a lot of investments to the financial sector, but I still think that the foreign direct investment hasn't arrived in the same kind of number. And maybe that because of how profitable it is to invest in the financial sector. It's one of the most profitable investments in the world. So how can these reforms reverse this problem? Well, in fact, as I said, we are in a process of important reforms, and ultimately they all have to do with investment. The purpose of everything that we do has to do with the job creation, and the only way of doing so is with investment, small or large investments, sustainable projects that create jobs and that bring the opportunities to large or small companies to create this job demand and quality jobs. So all these reforms are aimed at that purpose. We want to create investment, we want to attract investment, and we want to create jobs. So that's the purpose. Some of these reforms are more direct and some others are more elliptic. So clearly, our purpose is that. Now, I will talk about what these investments are or not. First, I will tell you something that I consider is one of the problems that Argentina has from a structural point of view. One of the problems is the lack of demand of jobs. We have an active population of 20 million people, and we have 6.2 million people who have formal private employment. This needs to change. This needs to grow strongly, and it hasn't grown for many years. And in order to do so, we need investment. When we created the Argentine Investment Agency, this agency is now administering large investment projects in Argentina that account for $76 billion. So it's not that we haven't received investment. We have received many investments, especially in the energy sector, infrastructure, and particularly we have been successful in a new sector that is renewable energies. But we have all these projects. It's around 590 projects. The interesting thing is that when you add the employment that will be created as of this investment, we only have 55,000 direct jobs. So therefore, the solution for job creation does not lie in large investment, but in SMEs in Argentina, because each of these investments creates an environment of SMEs that is also important. This is why it's very important the work that this agency does to land and guide the investments in our country, because we have all these bureaucratic obstacles. So we offer solutions to overcome this obstacle. So another very relevant topic in Argentina is public spending. And this is a great topic that is tackled with a reform and a fiscal agreement. For 15 years, the public spending grew from 25% of the GDP to 45% of the GDP. This means a strong growth, and we want to reduce this public spending, and in fact we have had this year by 2 points. And we keep on working to reduce it even more, and the fiscal agreement somehow sets a limit to growth in real terms of the public spending. And if we add to this the growth forecast that we'll have in Argentina, we expect to end by 2023 with a public spending of 33% of the GDP. So this is within the ranges of what would be a normal economy. Having said this, I believe that this has to do with what Mauricio calls the first commitment, and that is fiscal solvency. And we need to reduce the public spending, and we need to comply with the objectives so as to reduce the fiscal deficit. So all this combo is what attracts investments and what brings certainty to what is Argentina's direction, and that there will be no way back. Now, regarding commerce, there's also similar option, like some exports have grown, but also some imports that have grown even much more, and this is putting pressure on the deficit. And how can the reforms correct this imbalance? Well, it's not an issue of concern. Can you hear me now? So it's not an issue of concern since, as I said, this is a country that in the last 15 years it was closed to itself. And also there's a lot of lack of investments. The first area of imports are capital goods. And for us, that's a good news that Argentinians or that Argentinian companies are investing on equipment. We believe that this should come to a balance at some point. But we see this with no concern. I think that this is the time so that companies can get ready to become more competitive. And in that sense, the purchase and the import of capital goods, well, we are fostering this and we are facilitating it. Another issue regarding competitiveness, and many talk about the delay in the exchange rate, and probably this will be an issue until you solve the inflation issue, right? Well, yes. Obviously, I'm a minister of production. I would love to have a higher exchange rate so that we could be more competitive. It could be easier. But I believe that this is the counter side of a fiscal deficit, that it's financed in a more healthier way by issuing debt, and therefore there's a flow of dollars that enter Argentina, and somehow this makes the exchange rate remain low. This will keep on happening, and I think that this is why the competitiveness of the Argentinian economy has to do not so much with a high exchange rate, but so that we can work line after line, reducing our costs so as to improve our competitiveness. I think that it will end up being good for Argentina that we have this exchange rate pressure towards a low exchange rate, because this will force us to review our costs. Due to different reasons and due to the economic cycles of a crisis that Argentina has had, generally speaking, in the Argentinian economy, we never worked on a line-by-line basis. We had very high exchange rates. It was very competitive, and the exchange rate then started to be lower. They no longer was competitive, and then we entered a crisis without fiscal discipline. This time it will be different. I'm curious regarding the main objective of the government, so as to reduce poverty to zero. Have you calculated how many years could that take, given the projections, we will not reduce poverty to zero. That's an objective. This is an objective we stated that is very important, and it has different legs, a social leg, but from a point of view of the economy, well, we have one component, that's investment and the job creation. Now, the truth is that public policies that we've had so far, well, in 15 years, we had 30% of poverty. So when all Latin America reduced the poverty rates, all our neighboring countries were able to reduce poverty rates. So I think that an extremely mechanism to reduce poverty rates is a labor law that allows people to have more access to the formal labor market. And regarding the labor reform, can you explain a bit how this will solve the great number of people who work in the informal market in Argentina? Well, the law includes to order this or an amnesty. It is fashionable in Argentina. This amnesty means that the companies that want to denounce that they have an employee in informal conditions, they will be able to come forward without kind of punishment, and the state will take charge of 5 years of contributions to the pension fund systems and the benefit systems without having to pay. So this is very convenient, and we expect to have 1 million workers that are in the informal sector, and they will now be included in the formal sector. So, besides this, that same labor law, foresees a reduction of costs or of taxes on labor costs, not salaries, but the cost that an employer has to pay to Social Security per each employee. Since we want to reduce this cost, therefore the labor cost will end up being smaller, and therefore we will have more jobs created. Now, a question regarding how you communicate the reforms in a proper manner, because I don't know if it's true to say that one of the central targets of the government is to reduce deficit. And I think that most people do not understand quite well what the deficit is, and therefore these are very technical topics. Well, yes, people do not care that we reduce deficit. People care about having a job so that they have a better quality of life. And I think that the communication and how we convey this, it has to do with the facts. There's nothing that is more democratizing than a good infrastructure. We had the experience of investing strongly in the city of Buenos Aires when President Macri was a city mayor in the city of Buenos Aires, and we decided to improve public transportation. And it was a very important success because we were giving people more quality of life in the transportation, in how people commuted. So we improved the commuting times. And we have an infrastructure plan, and maybe it's the most important plan that Argentina has had in the last few years. We have a social policy that is very inclusive, and we have an economic policy that is making Argentina's economy grow. And we clearly want to improve the quality of employment, and this is what we're doing. But it's exactly what you said. If we talk to the population about how the fiscal deficit will improve, it's something that they will not be interested in. You know, we are famous of being very poor communicators at Cambiemos, and we have been dragging this for many years. So what we call the red circle, when we talk about politics, we talk about the red circle to talk about the population and this segment of the population that read the newspapers, that is highly informed, that they're interested on politics, that they watch the political TV shows. And this red circle is very critical of Cambiemos, and they say that we're not good at communicating. However, we won the elections. We've been winning one election after the next, and I think that we are communicating those sectors that do not belong to this red circle. So I think that we are achieving it, and we're doing it right. So that is what needs to be done if we want to do a deep change in Argentina. Now, what about the meetings of the WTO and the G20 presidency? How could this have a concrete impact on the economy? It will have, right? A direct impact. Yes. I would tell you the following. We have a deep strategy of integrating Argentina to the world, and we are institutionalizing Argentina in all the possible fronts. I believe that since we're being hosts of the WTO and we're going to be leaders of the G20 for 1 year, and when we have to have these accessing of the OECD, all these things that we're working on simultaneously, everything has to do with integrating to the world. We want to be a country more similar to those countries that grow and to apply better practices in each of the pillars of public administration. And I think that this is important. This creates growth and predictability for investors. So everything has to do with everything that we want, and it's to fight against poverty. Another of the reforms that I forgot to mention regarding the institutions, and there's a correlation between economic transformations and how strength institutions are. How do you think that the reforms are helping in that sense? To the economy, you mean? No, to strengthen institutions. Well, these are reforms that we are taking forward with the consensus. We have the particular situation that we are a minority in both chambers at Congress. So therefore, everything is done based on dialogue and consensus. We have to come to agreements. And we translate this into laws or acts, and therefore they have this power of consensus, dialogue, and agreement. So I believe that all these reforms have this common factor, that's consensus, agreement, and dialogue. A last question. Towards the end of President Macri's term, what will be the great changes that we will be able to see when he finishes? In what year? In 2019? I think that the most relevant thing will be to have offered a path of growth, like from the economic point of view, to have a non-volatile growth to the Argentinian economy, a sustainable growth, stable, safe growth, and that is a growth, a path of growth for 10 years, and with a 3% rate, and this will clearly change politics and the responsibility of rulers. In the city of Buenos Aires, we implemented important changes, and these changes had to do with improving the quality of life to the inhabitants of the city of Buenos Aires. So we raised the bar in such a way that it will be difficult to lower it. So that's a responsibility that we have. We will improve the administration of the public sector in Argentina. Let's hope that is the case. Thank you very much, Minister. A pleasure. Thank you.
Disculpen que estaba así agachado, no.
I'm sorry. I was sitting down inclined. I wanted to use a microphone. Now we will listen to Marcelo Scaglione, Undersecretary and Argentina's representative of the OECD, Chief of Staff of the Minister of Finance, the moderator, Carolina Millán from Bloomberg Market Reports.
ante todos estos avances que se están
with all these progresses that are being observed with the interministerial meetings and everything that is going on, we need to consider access to economic cooperation, an organization working towards best practices and public policies. The OECD works with 35 countries representing 60% of the world GDP and 75% of direct foreign investments in the world. This international organization that's most important in terms of best international public policies practices. Argentina is looking to join the organization, although we need to say that the relationship between the Argentina and the OECD is not new, but Argentina has adopted more than 30 of their topics, for instance, the PISA tests. So we have here with us Marcelo Scaglione from the Argentine representation. He has worked professionally in Argentina at the Accounts Tribunal in the nation. Then he was a consultant of the World Bank at the IDB. Then in France, he worked in the private sector with high-level positions in microfinances, consulting, and outsourcing companies. Now he's back in the country. He is Undersecretary of State by the Ministry of Economy and representative of the ministry before the OECD. As part of the efforts of President Macri of inserting the country in the world and in multilateral institutions, Argentina has taken substantive steps, which would be the main benefits in terms of economy, employment, poverty reduction. First of all, a brief introduction to supplement what you were just saying. The OECD is the objective was to refound Europe as from the Marshall Plan. Many times they mention the OECD as the rich countries club, and you all know this. The OECD was created when Europe was devastated by the Second World War to refound countries which had a high potential but that had been devastated by the Second World War, and that after a series of transformations with the support of the best practices from the OECD became rich countries. But I always want to go back to the basis. And if you visit the headquarters in France, you see that the building, the main building, is called Marshall Building. And at the entry, you also have the statement from President Kennedy when the U.S. decided to strongly push for the creation of the OECD. In terms of benefits, there are three main pillars. First of all, world governance. As from 2007, 2008, with the world financial crisis and the new role undertaken by the G20 in the world, the OECD as a home for the best practices through more than 250 committees and world groups establishes the best standards regarding economic policies, social policies, and above all, institutional policies. This, first of all, because as you were well saying, the 35 countries represent 75% of direct foreign investment in the world. And if there is a directive we have as from December 2015 when President Macri took office is to build trust. And then the rule of law. In this world where world governance is so relevant, and as we explained before, we had the presence for G20. We will start with the World Trade Organization, and working with these best practices will help us a lot by apply the best practices at an international level. And then social and economic benefits. Let me give examples to illustrate my answer. We were talking about the importance of the OECD in the refounding of Europe and for Japan as well. There's an example that I like very much is that of Poland, one of the countries that recently joined the OECD, and that thanks to joining jointly the OECD and the European Union was one of the few countries that was able to overcome the crisis of 2007, 2008, and in the last years have had an important growth of their GDP. And another example is South Korea. When the OECD, it was an agricultural country, essentially, which joined in 1996. Last year, it was 20 years for South Korea joining OECD, and now Korea is the 11th economy in the world, 6th world exporter, that in economic terms. But the OECD is not the new FMI, International Monetary Fund. It has to do with building institutions. It creates the PISA tests for measuring the educational quality. Korea 20 years ago was in the lowest levels at the PISA tests, and now they're amongst the first, very close to Finland, which is one of the leading countries. And Korea now has a life expectation that is higher than that of the countries of the OECD. And Korea is a democratic country where institutions work. There is a fundamental rule to become a member, that is to respect three basic principles: democracy, human rights, and market economy, promoting market economy. When Korea joined the OECD, it was very far from these fundamental values, and it was because of Japan's push to have greater presence of Asian countries in this house of best practices that promoted the entry of Korea. Korea is now a democracy, respecting human rights, fighting corruption with economic, sustainable and growth, as well as social growth. This is what we want for Argentina. Argentina still is pending a formal invitation. How soon could the country have that invitation, and what would be the roadmap ahead? Well, we have been talking to many players, many actors, 35 member countries, but in particular in Argentina, the chambers, the unions, the think tanks. Marcelo says very well what you say, but when are we joining in? Argentina is the country that consumes the most anxiety pills in the world, with the highest amount of psychologists and psychiatrists per square meter. We need to know that the process is long and complex. The OECD was created in 1961 with 20 countries, and 56 years later, there are 35 member countries. So 15 new countries joined in 56 years. It's a difficult selection process, and once you receive the invitation, it's very difficult to pass the tests. But something that's very important of an OECD country is that everything is evidence-based. And let me give you some indications about recent examples of countries joining the OECD. We have Latin American and European countries that between the time they presented themselves for joining till the moment they received the invitation took time. Once we receive the invitation, we are not members. We have formally started the process to pass 23 exams in 23 technical committees. That process took some countries between 3 to 10 years. It's only been 18 months since we started this process. Argentina expressed interest for joining the OECD. When the candidateship was presented the very next day, the 35 member countries decided to create a reflection think group to decide about the future of the OECD, if they would open up or not, and under which conditions. So when we presented our candidateship, the equation had 4 problems. First, to know if it would open up or not, if it would, under which rules. Third, to have a high level of support. At that moment, we had only 6 countries supporting Argentina to be a candidate. France, which was the first country to manifest it, Spain, Italy, Mexico, and Chile, but you need the support of all 35 members to do it. The third question mark was to be able to achieve support from all 35 member countries. And the fourth point, which is very relevant, is that all 35 countries agree in a package, because you don't join the OECD, but you join within a group of countries. We were able to sort out the first matter by the end of December last year. Argentina's candidateship generated strong interest because we decided not to stay without actions. The very next day, we created this group. We say we cannot wait for a year to have the mandate of the group to resolve this. So from the government, the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we came up with the action plan for Argentina and the OECD. We have chosen 16 public policies that were a priority. Out of the 23 we will be tested for, and we set up 60 specific commitments where Argentina committed, no matter what, be the OECD open or not, for us to comply with. Those 60 commitments were divided into 3 different areas. First, achieve Argentine presence in all 23 technical committees in the OECD to measure the effort that it has been made by the Argentine government. As you said, the relationship of Argentina with OECD is 35 years old. We started with a scheme of seeds, and we were able to join the Agriculture Committee at the time. And to join in each committee, it's like joining the OECD another time, but in a smaller area. We need to convince all countries about the mutual benefit for Argentina to be part of the different committees. So 1995 till 2016, Argentina was able to join to 8 committees. And in the action plan, we have a very ambitious goal, which was to go from 8 committees to all 23. What took us 22 years as a goal, we had for a goal for 18 months. We received yesterday the letter for the Health Committee, which is committee number 23. We will be with them next Monday and Tuesday. The second topic was addition of Argentina to a series of key OECD tools, both economic and financial tools, and related to social and institutional topics. One of these, and very important, and was explained by Minister Cabrera just now, about this being a minority in both chambers in Congress. The law of criminal responsibility for companies was approved, was passed. As we ended up the default with the holdouts a month ago, we ended up the default in the anti-corruption fight. Argentina was one of the 41 countries fighting for the anti-bribery commission for the OECD in 1997. It was the only one in the 40 countries that have not trespassed that commitment to the positive law. And we were able to do this by wide majority in the lower chamber and unanimous decision on the Senate. And the third point, it has to do with Argentine creativity. We were investigating about the last 15 years of access to the OECD, and we have this seen that it was not necessary to receive the formal invitation to start preparing for the tests. So as we were able to join the 23 committees where we are part already, and we have high-level representatives that will be those that will lead the passing of the exams, we have set as a goal out of the 16 priority policies to start working with 8 of those. For you to have an idea, the work method of the OECD per committee, first all 35 countries determine the baseline that we have for the different topics that is compared against best practices, and then a roadmap is established where the country commits itself to go from that baseline and move towards the best practices. Out of the 8 tests, 2 have been passed successfully. First one on statistics, second on macroeconomic policy. There are 6 more that are ongoing, and next week I will be presenting the final balance of these 18 months. We have complied with all 60 commitments with Argentina and the OECD. We have added 30 more. This allowed Argentina to go from 6 supports to all 35 supports from the different member countries. We have the ambassadors of Turkey and Mexico. We want to thank the support of your countries. Now all 35 countries are supporting the candidacy of Argentina. We have solved this third part of the equation. Now it's in the hands of the country members to discuss the package of countries. 6 candidates: Argentina, Peru, and Brazil; 5 Latin America, Romania, and Bulgaria on the European, Croatia, and Romania from the European Union, and they need to agree, and they have been doing those in the 6 months. A lot of progress has been seen from the side of government, but time frame from 3 to 10 years, it's quite wide with the speed of the reforms. Argentina seems to be closer to the 3 years, or will it take longer? And which will be the main challenges that could delay access? First of all, we set an objective of trying to obtain the invitation in 2 years, since June 2016 and June 2018, being very cautious because the decision is in the hands of the 35 member countries and we don't have any capacity of influence. But what we can say, and we can give the message to all 35 member countries, is that Argentina has now the momentum and the presidency of the G20. The 2 years of the Macri government's presidents have made important progress in economic terms, social terms, and institutional terms. Obtaining the invitation as soon as possible will allow us to make the most of this political momentum and somehow set anchor in a definite manner with these structural transformations. We always say we don't want to be part of the OECD just to be a member of a club of countries. That is not the case. We believe the OECD is important in relation to the rule of law, converging towards best practices, in economic terms, social, institutional. And to obtain the invitation as soon as possible is a guarantee for the Argentine government. The conversations we have, the ambassadors of country members here in Buenos Aires, with representatives in Paris, at the work made by the Foreign Office in all 35 capitals, we can say that this is a contract where both sides have to win. Argentina wins as far as we can definitely anchor the reforms and that there is no way back towards a populism which we already know where it leads to. But Argentina has innumerable opportunities in the economic sector. All 35 countries in the OECD represent 75% of foreign direct investment in the world, and what's the best guarantee for those investments that Argentina is a country member of the OECD. So if we are able in the next coming weeks for countries to agree, there is a new proposal by Secretary General with the possibility of having the entry of Argentina and Romania for the short term, two countries that are complying with the pre-qualification framework that was pushed by or fostered by the US. If that approval is achieved in the short term, it will be a very strong opportunity to continue to move forward in transforming our country. And then we will have to pass the tests. And here, let me review once again experiences of Latin American countries. The process in Chile took 3 years. Colombia is taking between 5 to 6 years. I think a time frame of 4 years would be reasonable to reach those goals. The complex topics, so many. Topics that had to do with competitiveness, trade, intellectual property rights. We are moving with an action plan, the one that we have started already, that allowed us to have a dialogue with all 35 countries, and for Argentina's priorities to be the priorities